There are three main transcendentalist authors which we will be talking about in this video: Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now let's start with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Mr. Emerson was born on May 25, 1803, in the Puritan New England town of Boston, Massachusetts, to Ruth Haskins and Unitarian minister William Emerson. Young Ralph had a strict but loving upbringing in the household of a minister who died when he was just 8 years old. It was the first of many untimely deaths of Emerson's relatives. While his father had died young, he was very close to his mother, siblings, and Aunt Mary Moody, who had a great and positive influence on his intellectual growth. Early on, young Waldo, as he liked to be called, started keeping journals and later would base many of his essays on his thoughts and observations expressed therein. While his writings were sometimes criticized as being too abstract, he was an eloquent and popular speaker. After studying the classics at the Boston Latin School, Emerson enrolled in Harvard College, graduating in 1821. He then taught at his brother William's Boston School for Young Ladies. On September 30th, 1829, he married Ellen Louisa Tucker. She died of tuberculosis a few years later, and her death caused another wave of religious questioning and doubt for Emerson. He next married Lydia Lydian Jackson on September 14, 1835, with whom he would have 4 children: Waldo, Ellen, Edith, and Edward. They settled in Concord, Massachusetts, where they would live for the rest of their lives, their home now the National Historic Landmark Ralph Waldo Emerson House. In 1832, Emerson sailed for Europe. His health had been troubling him for some time, and he was advised to take a rest. He visited England, Scotland, France, and Italy, meeting poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, and philosophers John Stuart Mill and Thomas Carlyle, with whom he maintained a lengthy correspondence published as Correspondence of Thomas Carlyle and R.W. Emerson. Emerson had been lecturing for some time, and in 1838 made his controversial Divinity School address at Harvard, whereupon he was labeled an atheist. In 1840, he started the magazine known as The Dial, with Margaret Fuller, which served as the official publication of the Transcendentalists until 1844. Emerson was a prolific essayist. Many of them first appeared in The Dial, many of them were lectures he had given. In 1872, the Emerson family sailed for Europe and Egypt, while their home, badly damaged by fire, underwent repairs. When they returned, Emerson continued to write and address students and admirers alike. At the age of 78, Emerson caught a cold from being out in the New England rainy damp weather, and it turned into pneumonia. On April 27, 1882, Ralph Waldo Emerson died at home in Concord, Massachusetts. Lydia survived him by 10 years and now rests beside him on Arthur's Ridge in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Middlesex County. Next up is Henry David Thoreau, born July 12, 1817, in Concord, Massachusetts, into the modest New England family of John Thoreau, a pencil maker, and Cynthia Dunbar. His most famous book, Walden, published in 1854, is an eloquent account of his experiment in near solitary living in close harmony with nature. It is also an expression of his transcendentalist philosophy. Thoreau grew up in Concord and attended Harvard, where he was known as a serious, though unconventional, scholar. During his Harvard years, he was exposed to the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who later became his chief mentor and friend. After graduation, Thoreau worked for a time in his father's pencil shop and taught at a grammar school, but in 1841 he was invited to live in the Emerson household, where he remained intermittently until 1843. He served as handyman and assistant to Emerson, helping to edit and contributing poetry and prose to the Transcendentalist magazine, The Dial. In 1845, Thoreau built himself a small cabin on the shore of Walden Pond near Concord. There he remained for more than 2 years, living deep and sucking out all the marrow of life, he said. Wishing to lead a life free of materialistic pursuits, he supported himself by growing vegetables and by surveying and doing odd jobs in the nearby village. He devoted most of his time to observing nature, reading, and writing, and he kept a detailed journal of his observations, activities, and thoughts. It was from this journal that he later distilled his masterpiece, Walden. The journal, begun in 1837, was also the source of his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, as well as his posthumously published Excursions, The Maine Woods, Cape Cod, and a Yankee in Canada. One of Thoreau's most important works, the essay Civil Disobedience, grew out of an overnight stay in prison as a result of his conscientious refusal to pay a poll tax that supported the Mexican War, which to Thoreau represented an effort to extend slavery. Thoreau's advocacy of civil disobedience as a means for the individual to protest those actions of his government that he considers unjust has had a wide-ranging impact on the British labor movement, the passive resistance independence movement led by Gandhi in India, and the nonviolent civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King in the United States. Thoreau is also significant as a naturalist to emphasize the dynamic ecology of the natural world. Above all, Thoreau's quite one-man revolution living at Walden has become a symbol of the willed integrity of human beings, their inner freedom, and their ability to build their own lives. Thoreau contracted tuberculosis in 1835 and suffered from it sporadically afterwards. In 1859, following a late-night excursion to count the rings of tree stumps during a rainstorm, he became ill with bronchitis. His health declined over 3 years, with brief periods of remission until he eventually became bedridden. Recognizing the terminal nature of his disease, Thoreau spent his last years revising and editing his unpublished works, particularly The Maine Woods and Excursions, and petitioning publishers to print revised editions of A Week and Walden. Aware he was dying, Thoreau's last words were, "Now comes good sailing," followed by 2 lone words, "Moose" and "Indian." He died on May 6, 1862, at age 44. Bronson Alcott planned the service and read selections from Thoreau's works, and Channing presented a hymn. Emerson wrote the eulogy spoken at his funeral. "Oh, Captain, my Captain," this time we're doing Walt Whitman. Born May 31st, 1819, died March 26, 1892. Considered by many to be the greatest of all American poets, Walt Whitman celebrated the freedom and dignity of the individual and sang the praises of democracy and the brotherhood of man. His Leaves of Grass, unconventional in both content and technique, is probably the most influential volume of poems in the history of American literature. Whitman left school in 1830, worked as a printer's devil, and later as a compositor. In 1838 to 1839, he taught school on Long Island and edited the Long Islander newspaper. By 1841, he had become a full-time journalist, editing successfully several papers and writing prose and verse for New York and Brooklyn journals. His active interest in politics during this period led to the editorship of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a Democratic Party paper. He lost this job, however, because of his vehement advocacy of abolition and the Free Soil movement. After a brief trip to New Orleans in 1848, Whitman returned to Brooklyn, continued as a journalist, and later worked as a carpenter. In 1855, Whitman published at his own expense a volume of 12 poems, Leaves of Grass, which he had begun working on probably as early as 1847. Prefaced by a statement of his theories of poetry, the volume included the poem later known as Song of Myself, in which the author proclaims himself the symbolic representative of common people. Although the book was a commercial failure, critical reviewers recognized the appearance of a bold new voice in poetry. 2 larger editions appeared in 1856 and 1860, and they had equally little public success. Leaves of Grass was criticized because of Whitman's exaltation of the body and sexual love, and also because of its innovation in verse form. The use of free verse in long, rhythmical lines with a natural, organic structure. Emerson was one of the few intellectuals to praise Whitman's work, writing him a famous congratulatory letter. Whitman continued to enlarge and revise further editions of Leaves of Grass. The last edition prepared under his supervision appeared in 1892. From 1862 to 1865, Whitman worked as a volunteer hospital nurse in Washington. His poetry of the Civil War Drum Taps, reissued with Sequel to Drum Taps, included his 2 poems about Abraham Lincoln. When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed, considered one of the finest elegies in the English language, and the much recited O Captain, My Captain. For a while, Whitman served as a clerk in the Department of the Interior, but he was discharged because Leaves of Grass was considered an immoral book. In 1873, Whitman suffered a paralytic stroke and after lived in a semi-invalid state. His prose collection, Democratic Vistas, had appeared in 1871, and his last long poem, Passage to India, was published in the 1871 edition of Leaves of Grass. From 1884 until his death, he lived in Camden, New Jersey, where he continued to write and to revise his earlier work. His last book, November Boughs, appeared in 1888.